Progressive Era. Industrialization, immigration, and urban expansion were major elements in the dramatic growth that the United States experienced during the last quarter of the 19th century. Accompanying this growth were both old and new concerns and problems about the lives of many Americans. Growth and associated problems are covered in Chapter 1718 and 19. By the turn of a reform movement had developed that included a wide range of groups and individuals with a common desire to improve life and the industrial age. Their ideas and work became known as the progressivism because that's the vision, because they wanted to build on the existing society, making moderate political changes and social improvements through government action. Most progressives were not revolutionaries but shared the goals of limiting the power of big business, improving democracy for the people, and strengthening justice. This chapter will examine the origins, efforts, and accomplishments of the Progressive Era. It should be recognized that while the progressives did not cure all of America's problems, they improved the quality of life, provided a larger role for the people, and their democracy established a precedence for a more active role for the federal government. The Progressive Era to Chapter. Woodrow Wilson in his campaign speech said, "I am therefore a progressive because we have not kept up with our own changes of conditions, is either in the economic old or in the political old. We have not kept up as well as other nations have. We have not adjusted our practices to the facts of the case." Although the progressive movement had its origins in the state reforms of the early S. It acquired national momentum only with the dawn of the new century, and the unexpected swearing into of a young president, Theodore Roosevelt. 1. So enthusiastic did middle-class Americans become about the need to adjust to changing times that the reformist impulse gave a name to an era, the Progressive Era. It lasted through the Republican presidencies of Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and the first term of the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. United States entry into World War I in 1917 diverted public attention away from domestic issues and brought the era to an end. But not before major regulatory laws had been enacted by Congress and various state legislatures. Entering anew, most Americans were well aware of how their century was rapidly changing. A once relatively homogeneous rural society of independent farmers was becoming an industrialized nation of mixed ethnicity centered in the rising power of big business, the increasing gap between rich and poor, the violent conflict between labor and capital, and the dominance of corrupt political machines in the cities. Most disturbing to minorities were the racist Jim Crow laws in the South that regulated African Americans to the status of second-class citizens. Crusaders for women's suffrage added their voices to the call for political reform and greater democracy. The groups participating in the progressive movement were extremely diverse. There were Protestant church leaders who championed one set of reforms, African Americans proposing other reforms, union leaders seeking public support for their goals, and feminists lobbying their state legislature for votes for women. Loosely linking the reform efforts under a single labor progressive was a belief that changes in society were badly needed and that government was the proper agency for correcting social and economic ills. Unlike the populist of the 1890s, whose strength came from rural America, citizens active in the progressive movement were chiefly middle-class residents of United States cities. The urban middle class had steadily grown in the decades of each century. In addition to doctors, lawyers, ministers, and storekeepers, the heart of the middle class in an earlier era, there were now thousands of white-collar workers and middle managers employed in banks, manufacturing RMS, and other businesses. Members of this business and professional middle class took their civic responsibilities seriously. They were disturbed about what might happen to American democracy from such conditions as unrest among the poor, excesses of the rich, corruption in government, and an apparent decline in morality. A missionary spirit inspired certain aspects of the middle-class progressivism. Protestant churches preached against vice and taught a code of social responsibility, which included caring for the poor and the less fortunate and insisting on honesty in public life. The social gospel popularized by Walter Rosa Rauschenbusch was an important element in Protestant Christians' response to the problem of urban poverty. Without strong leadership, the diverse focus of a number of dedicated and able leaders entered politics at the turn of the century to challenge the status quo. Theodore Roosevelt and Robert La Follette and the Republican Party and William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party demonstrated a vigorous style of political leadership that had been sorely lacking from national politics during the Gilded Age. What was the progressives' philosophy? The reform impulse was hardly new. In fact, many historians see progressivism as one more phase in the reforms tradition going back to the Jeffersonians, and in the early 1800s, the Jacksonians in the 1830s and the Populists in the 1890s. Without doubt, the progressives, like American reformers before them, were committed to democratic values and share the belief that honest government and just laws could improve the human condition. A revolution in thinking occurred at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Charles Darwin and his Origin of Species presented the concept of evolution, which had an impact well beyond simply justifying the accumulation of wealth. The way people thought and reasoned was challenged, and the prevailing philosophy of romantic transcendentalism, and America gave way to a balanced pragmaticism. In the early 20th century, William James and John Dewey were two leading American advocates of this new philosophy. They deemed truth in a way that many progressives found appealing. James and Dewey argued that the good and the true could not be known in the abstract as id and challengeless ideals. Rather, they said people should take a pragmatic or practical approach to morals, ideals, and knowledge. They should experiment with ideas and laws and test them in action until they found something that seemed to work well for the better ordering of society. Progressive thinkers adopted the new philosophy of pragmatism because it enabled them to challenge the notions that stood in the way of reform. For example, they rejected laissez-faire's theory as impractical. The old standard of rugged individualism no longer seemed viable in a modern society dominated by impersonal corporations. Scientific management. Another idea that gained widespread acceptance among progressives came from the practical studies of Frederick W. Taylor. By using a stopwatch to time the output of factory workers, Taylor discovered ways of organizing people in the most efficient manner, the scientific management system. Many progressives believed that government could be made more efficient if placed in the hands of expert and scientific managers. They objected to the corruption of political bosses, partly because it was anti-democratic and partly because it was an inefficient way to run things. The Muckrakers. Before the public could be roused to action, it first had to be well informed about the dirty realities of party politics and the scandalous conditions in factories and slums. Newspaper and magazine publishers found that their middle-class readers loved to read about underhanded schemes and politics. Therefore, in-depth investigative stories came to characterize much of the journalistic reporting of the era. Writers specializing in such stories were referred to as muckrakers by President Theodore Roosevelt. One of the earliest muckrakers was Chicago reporter Henry Demarest Loy, who in 1881 wrote a series of articles in the Atlantic Monthly attacking the practices of the Standard Oil Company and the railroads. Published in book form in 1894. Lloyd's Wealth Against Commonwealth fully exposed the corruption and greed of the oil monopoly, but failed to suggest how to control it. Magazines. An Irish immigrant, Samuel Sidney McClure, founded McClure's magazine in 1893, which became a major success by running a series of muckraking articles by Lincoln Stevens and another series by Ada Tarbell. Combining careful research with sensationalism, 3 articles set a standard for the deluge of muckraking that followed. Popular and cent magazines such as McClure's, Collier's, and Cosmopolitan Mopolitan competed earnestly to outdo the rivals with shocking exposes of political and economic corruption. Books. The most popular series of muckraking articles were usually collected and published as best-selling books. Articles in Tenement Life by Jacob Ruiz, one of the first photojournalists, were published as How the Other Half Lives in 1890. Lincoln Stevens' The Shame of the Cities in 1900 also caused a sensation by describing in detail the corrupt deals that characterized big city politics from Philadelphia to Minneapolis. Many of the muckraking books were novels of Theodore Driver's novels of Nancier, and the Titan portrayed the avarice and ruthlessness of an industrialist. Fictional accounts such as Frank Norris' The Octopus and The Pit were more effective than many journalistic accounts in stirring up public demands for government regulations. The decline of muckraking. The popularity of muckraking books and magazine articles began to decline after 1910 for several reasons. First, writers found it more and more difficult to top the sensationalism of the last story. Second, publishers were expanding and faced economic pressures from banks and advertisers to tone down their treatment of business. Road-by corporations were becoming more aware of their public image and developing a new specialty, the field of public relations. Nevertheless, MC breaking had a lasting effect on the progressive era. It exposed inequities and educated the public about corruption in high places and also prepared the way for corrective action. The cornerstone of progressive ideology was faith in democracy. Progressives believed that given a chance the majority of voters would elect honest officials instead of the corrupt officials handpicked by boss-dominated political machines. Progressives advocated a number of methods for increasing the participation of the average citizen in political decision-making. Political parties could manipulate and intimidate voters by printing lists or tickets of party candidates and watching voters drop them into the ballot box on election day. In 1888, Massachusetts was the first state to adopt a system successfully tried in Australia of issuing ballots printed by the state and requiring voters to mark their choices secretly within the privacy of a curtain booth. By 1910, voting in all states was done this way. In the latter century, it was the common practice of Republicans and Democrats to nominate candidates for state and federal offices and state conventions dominated by party bosses. In 1900, the progressive governor of Wisconsin, Robert Lafayette, introduced his state to a new system for bypassing politicians and placing the nominating process directly in the hands of voters. This method for nominating party candidates by majority vote was known as the direct primary. By 1915, some form of direct primary was used in every state. The system's effectiveness and overthrowing boss rule was limited as politicians devised ways of confusing the voters and splitting the anti-machine vote. Some southern states even used the primary system to exclude African Americans from voting. Before the progressive era, United States senators had been chosen not by the people but by majority vote of the state legislatures. Progressives believed this was a principal reason that the Senate had become a millionaires' club dominated by big business. Nevada in 1899 was the first state to give the voters the opportunity to elect United States senators directly. By 1912, a total of 30 states had adopted this progressive reform, and in 1913, adoption of the 17th Amendment required that all United States senators be elected by popular vote. Less successful were the progressives' efforts to reform the state legislatures, which largely remained under control of political bosses and machines. If politicians in the state legislatures backed at obeying the will of the people, then progressives proposed methods for forcing them to act. Amendments to state constitutions offered voters the initiative, a method by which voters could compel legislature to consider a bill, and the referendum, a method that allowed citizens to vote on proposed laws printed on their ballots. A road progressive measure, the recall, enabled voters to remove a corrupt or unsatisfactory politician from office by majority vote before that official's term had expired. Between 1889, when South Dakota adopted the initiative, and referendum in 1918, a total of 20 states, most of them west of the Mississippi, offered voters the initiative and the referendum, while 11 states offered the recall. Urban life in the progressive era was improved not only by political reformers, but also by the efforts of settlement house workers and his bonnet house workers and other civic-minded volunteers. Jane Addams, Francis Kelly, and other leaders of the social justice movement found that they needed political support in other state legislatures for meeting the needs of immigrants and the working class. They lobbied vigorously with considerable success for better schools, juvenile courts, liberalized divorce laws and sexist laws, and safety regulations for board tenements and factories. Believing that criminals should learn to become effective citizens, reformers fought such measures as a system of parole, separate reformatories for juveniles, and limits on death penalty. City bosses and their corrupt alliance with local businesses and utility companies, for example, were the first target of progressive leaders. In Toledo, Ohio in 1897, a self-made millionaire with strong memories of his origins as a working man became the Republican mayor, adopting Golden Rule as both his policy and middle name. Mayor Samuel M. Golden Rule Jones delighted Toledo citizens by introducing a comprehensive program of municipal reform, including 3 kindergartens, night schools, and public playgrounds. Another Ohio, and Tom L. Johnson, devoted himself to the same of tax reforms and extreme form, and 3-cent trolley fares for the people of Cleveland. As Cleveland's mayor from 1901 to 1909, Johnson fought valiantly but without success for public ownership and operation of the city's public utility services, water, electricity, and trolleys. Reform leaders rose in other cities throughout the nation, seeking to break the power of city bosses and take utilities out of the hands of private companies. By 1915, fully 2/3 of the nation's cities on their water systems. As a result of progressives' efforts, many cities also came to own and operate gas lines, electric power plants, and transportation systems. New types of municipal government were another progressive innovation. In Galveston, Texas, was the Saint City to adopt a commission plan of government in which voters elected the heads of cities, police, and sanitation departments. Not just the mayor, ultimately proving itself effective. Then commission plan was a system first tried in Dayton, Ohio in 1913, and which an expert manager was hired by an elected city council to direct the work of various departments of city government. By 1923, more than 300 cities had adopted the manager-council plan of municipal government. At the state level, reform governors battled corporate interest and championed such measures as the initiative, the referendum, and the direct primary to give the common people control of their own government. In New York, Charles Evans Hughes battled fraudulent insurance companies. In California, Hiram Johnson successfully fought against the economic and political power of the Southern Apache Railroad. In Wisconsin, Robert La Follette established a strong personal following as the governor in 1900 to 1900, and for who won passage of the West Constant Idea, a series of progressive measures that included a direct primary law, tax reform, and regulation of railroad rates. Whether or not to shut down saloons and prohibit the drinking of alcohol was one issue over which the champions of reform were sharply divided. While urban progressives recognized that saloons were often the neighborhood headquarters of political machines, they generally had little sympathy for the temperance movement. Rule reformers, on the other hand, thought they could clean up morals and politics in one stroke by abolishing liquor. The Dries prohibitionists were determined and well organized. By 1915, they had persuaded the legislatures of 2/3 of the states to prohibit the sale of alcoholic beverages. While progressive governors and mayors were battling conservative forces in the state houses and city halls, 3 presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, sought broad reforms and regulations at the national level. Following President McKinley's assassination in September 1901, Theodore Roosevelt went to the White House at the age of 40, to the youngest president in the United States history, and also the most athletic. He was unusual not simply because of his age and vigor, but also because he believed that the president should do much more than lead the executive departments. He thought it was a president's job to set the legislative agenda for Congress as well. Thus, by the accident of McKinley's death, the progressive movement suddenly shot into high gear under the dynamic leadership of an activist, reform-minded president. Presidents in the 19th century had constantly taken the side of business and its conflict with labor. Hayes in the Railroad strike of 1877 Cleveland and the Pullman strike of 1890 for Roosevelt, however, and the first economic crisis of his presidency, demonstrated that he favored neither business nor labor but insisted on a square deal for both. The crisis involved a strike of anthracite coal miners through much of 1902. If the strike continued, many Americans feared that without coal they would freeze to death when winter came. Roosevelt took the unusual step of trying to mediate the labor dispute by calling a union leader and coal mine owners to the White House. The mine owners' stubborn refusal to compromise angered the president. To ensure the delivery of coal to consumers, he threatened to take over the mines with federal troops. The owners narrowly agreed to accept endings of special commission, which granted a wage increase $2 a day to the miners but did not grant union recognition. Voters overwhelmingly approved Roosevelt and his square deal by electing him by a landslide in 1904. Roosevelt further decreased his popularity by being the first president since the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 to enforce that poorly written law. The trust that he most wanted to bust was the combination of railroads known as the Northern Securities Company. Reversing its position in earlier cases, the Supreme Court in 1904 upheld Roosevelt's action and breaking up the railroad monopoly. Roosevelt later directed his Attorney General to take antitrust action against Standard Oil and more than 40 other large corporations. Roosevelt did make a distinction between breaking up bad trust which harmed the public and stifled competition and competition and regulating good trusts which through efficiency and low prices dominated the market. President Roosevelt also took the initiative in persuading a Republican majority in Congress to pass laws that significantly strengthened the regulatory powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Under the Elkins Act in 1903, the Interstate Commerce Commission had greater authority to stop railroads from granting rebates to favorite customers. Under the Hepburn Act in 1900, the Commission could fix just and reasonable rates for railroads. The Jungle, a muckraking book by Upton Sinclair, described in horrifying detail the conditions in the Chicago stockyards and the meat packing industry. The public outcry following the publication of Sinclair's novel caused Congress to enact two regulatory laws in 1900. One, the Pure Food and Drug Act, forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of adulterated or mislabeled foods and drugs. Two, the Meat Inspection Act provided that federal inspectors visit meatpacking plants to ensure that they met minimum standards of sanitation. As a lover of the wilderness and the outdoor life, Roosevelt made enthusiastic champion of the cause of conservation. In fact, Roosevelt's most original and lasting contribution and domestic policy may have been his efforts to protect the nation's natural resources. Three actions stood out as particularly important. One, during his presidency, Roosevelt made repeated use of the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 to set aside 150 million acres of federal land as national reserve that could not be sold to private interests. Two, in 1900, Roosevelt won passage of the new Lands Reclamation Act, a law providing money from the sale of public land for irrigation projects in western states. 3, in 1908, the president publicized the need for conservation by hosting a White House conference on the subject. Following his conference, a National Conservation Commission was established under Gifford Pinnock of Git for Pinocchio, Pennsylvania, who Roosevelt had earlier appointed to be the first director of United States Forest Service. Taft's presidency. The good-natured William Howard Taft had served in Roosevelt's cabinet as Secretary of War. Honoring the two-term tradition, Roosevelt refused to see re-election and picked Taft to be his successor. The Republican Party readily endorsed Taft as its nominee for president in 1908 and, as expected, defeated for a third time the Democrats' campaigner William Jennings Bryan. Taft continued Roosevelt's progressive policies. As a trust buster, Taft ordered the prosecution of almost twice the number of antitrust cases as his predecessor. Among these cases was one against the United States Steel, which included a merger approved by then-President Theodore Roosevelt. An angry Roosevelt viewed Taft's action as a personal attack on his integrity. As a conservationist, he established the Bureau of Mines, added large tracts in the Appalachians to the national forest reserves, and also set aside federal oil lands. He was the first president to do so. Two other progressive measures were at least equal in importance to legislation and acted under Roosevelt. The Man Elkins Act of 1910 gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to suspend new railroad rates and oversee telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. The TH Amendment ed by the states and TH authorized the United States government to collect an income tax. This reform was originally proposed by the populace in their 1892 platform. Progressives heartily approved the new tax because at first it applied only to the very wealthy. Progressives in the Republican Party were unimpressed with tax achievements. In fact, they became so disenchanted with his leadership that they accused him of betraying their cause by joining the conservative wing of the party. These were the reasons Payne, Aldridge, Tariff, Derrick, his 19-0 campaign. Taft had promised to lower the tariff instead. Conservative Republicans in Congress passed the Payne-Aldridge tariff in 19-0, which raised the tariff. Progressives in the Republican Party were unimpressed with tax achievements. In fact, they became so disenchanted with his leadership that they accused him of betraying their cause by joining the conservative wing of the party. These were the reasons. Payne, Aldridge, Tariff, Derrick, his 19-0 campaign. Taft had promised to lower the tariff instead. Conservative Republicans in Congress passed the Payne-Aldridge tariff in 19-0, which raised the tariff on most imports. Taft angered progressives in his party not only by signing the tariff bill but by making a public statement in its defense. Peanut Ballinger controversy. The progressives liked and respected the chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Peanut, as a dedicated conservationalist. On the other hand, they distrusted Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Bollinger, especially after he opened public lands in Alaska for private development. And when Peanut criticized Volant, besides Bollinger, Tafted by his cabinet member and read Peanut for insubordination. Conservatives applauded, progressives protested. House Speaker Joe Cannon. The progressive Republicans became angrier with the president when he failed to support their effort to reduce the dictatorial powers of Congress. Leading conservative Speaker of the House Joseph Cannon. For midterm elections, getting back against his progressive critics, Taft openly supported conservative candidates for Congress in the midterm elections of. It was a grievous mistake. Progressivism was now at high tide, and progressive Republicans from the Midwest easily defeated the candidates endorsed by Taft. After this election, the Republicans' party was split wide open between two opposing groups, a conservative fraction loyal to Taft and a progressive fraction. The latter group of Republicans fervently hoped that their ex-president and hero Theodore Roosevelt would agree to become their candidate again in 1912. A third party developed in the first decade of the 1900s that was dedicated to the welfare of the working class. Originally called the Socialist Labor Party, in 1897 it changed its name in 19-0 to the Socialist Party of America. The Socialist platform called for more radical reforms than progressive, favored public ownership of the railroad, utilities, and even a major industry such as oil and steel. Eugene versus Debs. One of the founders of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, was the party's candidate for president in 5 elections, the first in 1900 and the last in 1920. A former railway union leader who adopted socialism while jailed for the Pullman strike. Debs was an outspoken critic of business and a champion of labor. On such issues as workers' compensation and minimum wage laws, progressives and some socialists joined forces. For the most part, however, progressives wanted to distance themselves from the ideas of socialists, since the majority of voters favored only mild reforms, not radical causes. Eventually, however, some socialist ideas were accepted: public ownership of utilities, the 8-hour workday, and pensions for employees. The party reached its peak in the presidential election of 1912 when Debs received over 900,000 votes, 6% of the total. Reform efforts dominated a campaign that involved four notable presidential candidates: President Taft was renominated by the Republicans after his supporters excluded Theodore Roosevelt's delegates from the party's convention. Progressive Republicans then formed a new party and nominated Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's claim that he was as strong as a bull moose gave New Progressive Party its nickname the Bull Moose Party. After lengthy balloting, Democrats united behind Woodrow Wilson, a newcomer who had been elected to office as governor of New Jersey, the Socialist Party gaining strength and again nominated Eugene Debs. With Taft enjoying little popularity and Debs considered too radical, the election came down to a battle between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt called for a new nationalism with more government regulation of business and unions, women's suffrage, and more social welfare programs. Wilson pledged a new freedom which would limit both big business and big government, bring about reform by ending corruption, and receive competition by supporting small businesses. With the Republican split, Wilson won easily with 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt received 88, Taft received 8, and Debs received none. The Democrats gained control of Congress, although Wilson was a minority president with 41% of the popular vote. Roosevelt got 27%, Taft got 23%, and Debs received 6%. The overwhelming support for the progressive presidential candidates ensured that reform efforts would continue. With the Republican split, Wilson won easily with 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt received 88, Taft received 8, and Debs received none. The Democrats gained control of Congress, although Wilson was a minority president with 41% of the popular vote. Roosevelt got 27%, Taft got 23%, and Debs received 6%. The overwhelming support for the progressive presidential candidates ensured that reform efforts would continue under Wilson, while the failures of the Progressive Party to elect local candidates gave evidence that new party would not last. But the idea contained in Roosevelt's new nationalism of strong federal government regulations helping the people did have a lasting influence for much of the century. See Chapter 24 in the New Deal and Chapter 28, The Great Society. To be continued.